Hey there, Forrest. Those are some really cool saxophones that you have going on in there. All right, so I just want to jump right into the evaluation criteria and sort of judge the score by that. I'm not really seeing a ton of problems in terms of the the abilities of the instruments or anything like that, or proper notation practices, things to counsel you on. There are a couple of sort of preliminary things, and that is, you know, you. I will say one or two things. You really are dealing with massive textures throughout here, and even when you mark things down a little, it still has a big, fierce, huge sound. And here I feel like you are kind of counting on the divisi to be very full and loud, or like just almost like big harp chords if the harp were a much louder instrument. And right here, the players are probably going to have to divide up. I'm sort of thinking like, sort of thinking like a viola player. I would say probably what's going to happen here is you could divide this into two parts. Like one of the viola players playing B, and then jumping up here to jumping up here to F, and then the other player could be playing first B and then a B octave, right? So that would be the best way to divide this, because octaves are no big deal on viola, especially up there, like with one finger on the A string and the other one on the D string. It's all doable. So yeah, I mean, and then right in here, I mean, I would also recommend this being played divisi just because of the speed, right? But you're throwing in a lot of you're throwing in a lot of chords just willy nilly, and you're not marking them divisi, and you're not really working out how they would be divided between the players. So that's one concern, right? Like getting this ready for the stands. That would be a concern. Of course, in that context, we also have to think about just the availability of players for saxophone. And I think I've commented on this a few times now, seeing saxophones in other entries, and also some talk about saxophones in the group. Just mentioning my own experience with having an early symphony of mine rejected by a European orchestra because it had a couple of saxophones in it, and it had two altos. And had I just rescored those parts for English horn and third bassoon, then they might have accepted it. Maybe I would have made it past that particular level of criteria. But as it was, they just turned it down flat because they didn't feel that they had access to saxophone players at that point. So anyway, so that's you're asking for three of them. So I would say just think of if you want to take this further and really look at it as a piece of a real serious arrangement that you're going to get ready for some orchestra to play. I would say try to find some alternate instruments, whether it's, like I said, adding a second English horn player and a third bassoon player, and that would cover a lot of these parts. And then you might find other available instruments that can play some of these pitches as well. All right, so speaking on that same topic, you have a very, very bright, very, very brash color to this scoring, and it isn't just the mock-up, the sound of the sound set being a little tinny, almost being a little cheesy at times, if you know what I mean. Like it's not a put down, but just more like, it's it's kind of dulling the magnificence of your ideas, if you know what I mean. It's like it's not, and you also have this kind of big scope scoring. People are turning in entries and they're slowing them down to get a more of a sense of grandeur, right? And right in here, like you have these bomb 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 bomb. You have that sort of thumping back and forth kind of accompaniment, and it almost makes it march like. You know what I mean? Or rather than dance like. So that's another thing to watch out for. If you're concerned that it isn't sounding sprightly enough or jumpy enough, bouncy enough, then that it could just be that it's getting that is pulling down on it. Of course, like if you really love that idea, then you should stick with it because it's really fun. That is the first time I've heard somebody apply that particular bass to this idea. Okay, and then another kind of overall concern is the prevalence of the snare drum. And I don't understand this. It says snare drum, and then you have this. It really looks like maybe this was supposed to be cymbals, and then it says two snare drum. And then you're already playing the snare drum part, right? So the place to say two snare drum is back at the end of the previous part. So you might want to start off with this being cymbal, I guess, or something. Maybe that was gong. And then say two snare drum here, and then it's snare drum from there on, right? It really isn't a whole lot of time to change over to snare drum if this is a cymbal pair, right? If the player is holding these two dishes in one in either hand, then they have to put them down, pick up snare sticks, and then start playing this pattern on the snare drum. Now, bass drum, you're going fast, but you're not going so fast that you should mark your bass drum notes as half notes. I think it is perfectly fine to just mark these as quarter notes because you just have to let the hull do the work with bass drum and just trust that the sound of the drum is going to really carry through. Now, if you really want to kind of muffle and damp the sound and make it extra short, then I would say mark eighth notes. Now, here you want the opposite. You really want the bass drum to continue on, but a lot of bass drum players have a problem with that. Like with long, they are muffling the sound of the bass drum because they don't want the membrane to vibrate too much because that has its own weird kind of sound. And I just feel it's more effective, like a stroke from the bass drum pushing at the reverb of the hull. That's the most effective way of all, I feel, to score it. And but I mean, to get back to this whole idea of snare drum, the snare drum is really, really just dominating this entire screen. And after a while, it just gets to be, just a little, I mean, okay, so here you got a bit of, I'm assuming cymbal crash, and then no snare, and then you bring in the snare as kind of I mean, you're saying piano here, but it really sounds like forte or mezzo forte in the mix, right? It's turned up or something. Anyways, it's very loud. And then when you come back with your big tutti idea again, you're still on the snare drum, and then I guess this is intended to be like side stick or rim, and then it's back again. See, so it just really is. It's kind of making everything feel like the same thing, right? You want some variation from section to section, from part to part, and that's one of the things that's kind of dragging it, like making things a little too homogeneous, right? And then I mean, of course, that is a concern throughout the entire page. That like for instance, like in these little gaps here, the gaps are still fairly fully orchestrated, and I mean that it is nice that there's a bit more breathing space. But yeah, so now let's dive into the evaluation criteria. I said I was going to go straight into them, but then I saw a few things that I wanted to talk about. Okay, so pitch weight in the upper middle register of the piano score, that's not a concern here. In fact, you are hugely, you have a huge scope throughout the entire page. The only place where you really pull back is right in here. Okay, but that takes us to our next concern, and that is thematic material repeats often, possibly sounding repetitive if orchestrated the exact same way throughout. Now, you don't orchestrate it exactly the same way throughout. You have a lot of variation in the treatment of parts, but the overall effect is the same, if you know what I mean. Like the intensity, the bigness of the scoring really sounds very similar. And part of it is just because you've got these big triple stops here. You've got the same basic approach in the middle strings. You've got these upper winds kind of hammering away above, and whether you have got your whether you've got your winds and your saxophones kind of working together, or you've got your brass, the sound of this is really very similar in the way that it's scored. So the effect is fairly the same, and especially when you consider that the saxophones, when they're teamed up in this way, they're going to create a sort of a brass-like sound, and then we've got the same brass-like sound with the trumpets, right, and then the horns below, and so on. So that even though you have explored different approaches, the sound is going to be similar, and that is kind of driven home by the sound set, which just really is. I'm not sure what sound set that is. It doesn't sound like Note Performer, which I think would have more variation, which kind of shows some of your mixing around of different elements in a much better light. So yeah, so I would say you even with the work that you did on it, you would, in order to fulfill that criteria, I think you would need to make the parts even more discrete, or the sections more discrete. Now, you don't have to do that. You could just just leave it the way it is and just say, well, that criterion is not important to me, Thomas, and I completely think that's fine. That's it is up to you to decide what is appropriate in terms of scope for your work. Now, the next two questions are the melodic development soaring rather high, and it's kind of strange the way you do this. And yeah, see, all right. So the problem here is that you've got your piccolo at its highest from the very beginning, right? So if the piccolo were coming in at the same octave as the flute, then right here it could play this right in here in the violins, and then the violins could actually play down a little bit rather than playing exactly those same pitches, and they would get then you would have your illusion, I think, a lot more effectively scored. But I think at this point, like the penetration of the piccolo is so extreme at that level. You're going up to these high A's and so on. That's the sound of the piccolo just gets to be so intense, it'll really take over everything. And so it's better to have the piccolo be the part that plays this right in here at that pitch, right? So that would be down an octave from how you've scored it here, but then going up to the point where it can reach the high D and so on and so forth. And then the other parts doing this little dropping down, including the first violins. Second violins are great. I like the whole idea of the octave scoring right in there. That's very, very cool. Now, it's just a question of balance right in here. You're pushing in on that third beat here with saxophones and trombones. Okay, and then of course the pizzicato, and it's going to have a very even at piano it's going to have a rather cutting sound with those accents, right? Just because there are accents in the piano score doesn't mean there have to be accents in the orchestration, right? I mean, it'd be better to have it in the melody, and and then maybe you could have some in the pizzicato, but no need to have it in the bass and in the brass and so on. All right. Now I noticed that there is a lot of timpani roll in this score. Some on this page, and just a ton of timpani roll. And I want you to think about what that does to the a timpani roll. Actually, any timpani stroke introduces a certain amount of overtones that sort of they take up a notch in the resonance of the music. And the same thing is true of cymbals, and same thing is true of that sort of kind of the snare part of the snare drum sound, right? That has that white noise kind of a sound. So that's another reason why you can suck the life and the resonance and the color out of a score by having too much snare drum. Now, tambourine also has that same quality, but it is less. It's a jingle kind of a sound rather than a sort of a kind of that constant muffled rippling sound. And of course, castanets are perfect for this because they are little clicks that come and go very, very abruptly. So I would just say that the piccolo is scored too high, rather than tracking at the octave. I think it's just is really intense. You're setting up a triple octave here. It's probably better to have it playing lower pitches and then coming in and then taking over this register and then playing da 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 rather than breaking it up, because breaking this up just becomes too prominent. And then the drop right in here is going to be heard very, very easily, right? Whereas if you switch it and you have the piccolo starting off and from the very beginning playing all the way up like this, maybe playing in conjunction with the flute and then continuing on upwards, and then having the violins be the one to drop, then they don't have to go all the way up to this screaming high E, right? So just to reiterate once again, it's not that violinists cannot play these high notes, right? The question is the timbral quality of them, right? Just because somebody can play something doesn't mean that they should play something, right? And I mean, doubling it with piccolo and going up into the piccolo's high register, there's a certain sense of urgency and and tension that really starts to dominate everything. All right. So, speaking of the accompaniment figures, I felt like you're realizing them in this way, with clarinets and the pizzicato strings, and I felt that like on the that part, it could have had a little bit more doubling. Especially if it's going to have this kind of this more widely spaced kind of a realization. And then here you have like no doubling in the winds. And I feel that is a weakness right in there, right? So, but there's like, aside from the fact that like you're kind of not working out how the divisi is going to go here, it's still okay. All right. Now we're getting to this section in here, and my My concern, of course, in the evaluation criteria is that if everything is in the upper middle register, then it's relentless when you get to here. I feel that we have the opposite problem now, and that is that there's a sense of relentless tutti, right? Just especially at the kind of furious, very kind of fully scored and just really snare heavy kind of scoring, right? So how to tame that a little bit? Well, you pull back on your saxophones, and that helps a lot, right? Uh, but maybe not so much high trombone right in there. Take out the snare, um, and make this less about kind of pounding, crashing, rippling sort of music, and more about the expression of the melody. Yeah, ba 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 bum ba 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 bum. Do you know what I mean? That's that might be a better way of setting this up. See, that's the other thing, is that I feel that this does not really set this up so much, right? It's just more, it's like one more big tutti, and then, oh, by the way, there's this thing here, right? So I think that leading into this a little bit more naturally, from, just starting, getting all the way to the end of this phrase, and then starting a new phrase on the second beat that leads to this a little bit better. So this can lead to the next section, right? Okay. And then, right in here, there's more timpani, there's more tambourine trill. So like maybe like there could be places in the music where there's some relief from the percussion, right? Just kind of giving it a little bit more space so that we can hear the kind of the more natural feel of the other instruments. I think it's really cool though that you've thrown in all this saxophone. I think it's really, really fun. Like, how could this be played by other wind instruments though? Probably, like, I would say English horn on the lower voice, and oboe on the top voice, and bassoon below. All right, now dun 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 dun. Dun. And right in here, like, you do ease off on your sort of massive tutti kind of thing, but it still has a real edge of really filling things in, and you have tons and tons of accents. And yes, some of these are in the score, right? But like, once again, like, we have to. Maybe I should have made this a one of the pitfalls in the announcement video, is that, like, you don't have to have all the accents, because it's just really going to it's going to feel sort of heavy-handed after a while. The main concern for me though is, like, you have all of these resources. How individualized can they be? Like, wouldn't it have been cool if this line right in here were a baritone sax solo, and then this line right in here, this sort of answering line, was a alto saxophone solo, right? There are. I feel that things are still being used together in very, in very aggressive, very kind of clumped together ways, rather than kind of the natural sound of things coming out a little bit more. Like, for instance, like teaming up horns and clarinets, like, right on top of each other, rather than having a degree of separation between them, so that we can hear the individual colors a little bit better. All right, and that just kind of leads to the whole questions of contrast of color and breadth of texture. There are tons of contrasts of color in this. That's great. Maintaining differentiated roles in closely spaced harmonies and overlapping accompaniment figures. Aside from just the the real intensity that you've got going in there, you do have some of that going on. And I really love this little melody in here. See, like, this trumpet melody would be so effective if it didn't have the upper winds above it. Bah, 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 yada da da dum. I feel like you can really ease off in some of these passages, right? Like, let solos be solos. And you did some cool stuff with the high interjecting E's, right? Like you got this, you got this pizzicato here, and these E's right in here. So that's kind of cool. And then just and then and then you just have the trumpets going, hitting this right at the top, at the in the middle of the trombone, which that kind of works. Oops. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, you're managing things in a pretty good way, I would say. And then like you've got your this is really wonderful right in here, the bassoon and tuba little octave exploration right in here. With the violas and first violins doing some doubling in there. Okay, and that just takes us to the triplet section. And one of the concerns I've got on my list of criteria, keeping the triplets from overwhelming the melodic line, having widely reaching left-hand patterns. To a degree, there's also a concern, of the melody itself, like how much weight is on that line, and you really don't like if you have things like this, like melodic line, diminuendo to mezzo piano, accompaniment section scored mezzo forte, then you're in trouble, right? The triplets are all fine and dandy, and they are certainly a mysterious essential element, but the melody is what's important here, right? And like you have this lovely idea of doubling or tripling, if you will, the first clarinet, first bassoon, and first violin. And I think that that's a really beautiful color, right? And it should be more prominent, right? What if that were, instead of mezzo piano, what if that were mezzo forte and then everybody else was sort of piano or mezzo piano, right? And then the like the I think you would hear the colors come out a lot better, right? And especially if you're going to have brass going pop, 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 right? There's a sort of sense of unclarity that is in the mock-up right in here, and that will also be present in performance, right? I think that you need to balance things a little bit differently. And right here is where my caution about the overtones from the timpani roll. Now, so part of that is there's the obnoxious color of the mock-up itself, but it will be one of these things where I mean, especially like that higher E will it'll really start to push like at its own octave overtone is blotting out the melody, right? So that's some more interference that you've got with that, right? So yeah, so those are just a few things to think about right in there. Yeah, but I mean, otherwise, like the whole strategy of the scoring is not so bad. You've got you're sort of dividing this up between second violins and violas. That's all right. And clarinet and bassoon, that's fine, and just a little touch of tenor saxophone, grabbing the same thing that the violas are doing. That's okay if everybody is kind of playing it softly. Like the tenor saxophone will have a tendency to make it pretty buzzy, right? And then you've got those the being played between staccato lower brass and arco strings, right? So here's another place where you need to balance things. So, I mean, it might be a case where like the melody, I would really say the best approach here might be to have the strings mezzo forte throughout, and then to have the winds mezzo piano except for the melodic line, right? It's just like the normally I wouldn't suggest such such sort of tweaky dynamic mixing, except just the close spacing of things right in there, right? You kind of need to keep your brass and your winds back because they're kind of robbing a lot of life out of the strings. Okay, well, I probably shouldn't go on and on about this. I think that you pretty much get the drift of what I'm saying, but I mean, despite me going through this with a pair of tweezers, I think that it was just really such a fun score and had so much life and energy and directness. You know what I mean? It was you're not holding back. You're not shy about it. You are just blasting your way through this, and that's that is fun. That has its own validity, and the sincerity of it cannot be questioned. Along with a lot of the real intricate ingenuity, right? That just like, but some of the things that you've got in here kind of don't work because of the articulation that you have imported from the piano score, but they would work fine if you just got rid of so many accents, right? Especially when you go to softer passages, right? And then speaking of softness, like there's a lot to be said for restraint, right? To make your more intense moments all the more effective, right? So there just kind of was very little restraint in this. So think about some of those proportions and the scope of it. I think you're onto something with this really powerful approach. And so I think that like it would be all the more challenging to you to take on the 2022 orchestration challenge and see what see how that fit into your kind of natural sensibilities of grandeur and very large, very energetic scoring. So thank you so much for this. Just really a delight to look over, and once again a score with a lot for me to talk about and address, and that always makes me really happy. And I have a huge smile on my face right now. So thanks for that, and for your support on Patreon and keeping the channel going. It just means a lot to me. I do not get tired of saying it, and I don't feel that it is stale or repetitive going by my own orchestration criteria, because I just feel it in every one of these entries as I wrap it up and I get towards the end. I really feel that gratitude. So thanks so much, Forrest, and it really does mean a lot. And to all my Patreon supporters and website subscribers, everybody watching out this, leave a comment for Forrest if you've got any other ideas about some things maybe that I missed or didn't have enough time to talk about. There was a lot that I noticed that I could go into, but this isn't supposed to be a massive orchestration lesson. It's supposed to be an evaluation, right? So I really enjoyed it. Please keep sending me orchestration challenge evaluations for our entries for these evaluation rounds. Really, really enjoyable. And that with one more score, we'll wrap up the semi-brev evaluations, and I will move on to the dotted semi-brev very, very soon.